terrible warning. The reckoning is at hand. Or, from another perspective, it's just time for our weekly little webcast thing, live stream thing, our vlog. It's vlog time with the Courier people. I'm No Shanika. You remember me. I've been around. I work at DevRel for Courier. And with us, we have two people here because two is all we need. With us is V, and I'm going to point in the right direction the first time. Hello, V. Ah, I did it. V, say hi to the people. Tell them what you do for Courier.
Hello, everyone. I'm a software engineer at Courier, and I'm super excited to be here and talk to you all.
I love it. Thank you so much. We saw a good number of people watching the show on demand last week. That was very rad, seeing as it's just a new thing that we're trying out. We're going to be rebranding and retooling as we get it figured out. We're really realizing that we mainly want to talk to people who are working on SaaS products. And so this is probably news to me, but next week we'll have like our titling and stuff. We'll be like, hey, it's the SaaS Developers Corner Hour, 45 minutes plus commercials. I don't know what we're going to call it, but we'll figure out a name. That'll be fun. But we just had a few little news items that I thought would be fun to talk about this week, starting with this thing that was actually just like it was like a survey that I saw up on Hacker News that sort of sparked some conversation I thought was kind of interesting, called like the state of open source software monetization. And we're all kind of aware that this is like not something where the dust has fully settled, right? Where we have really big nonprofits like the Linux Foundation and CNCF out there saying, hey, we'll take these like large corporate donations and pay something to a certain amount of developers and also do things like support. But we also have situations like Log4j, right? Where really big corps are just sort of asking an open source developer, hey, will you fix this problem right now, right? And V, you were saying you had kind of a hot take on this, which I would love to hear about.
Yeah. Well, personally, it's my belief that you shouldn't be trying to monetize off of all open source software in general. And I think and I can break that down. I think that you get a lot of benefits from using open source software. That is a tongue twister, so I'm going to struggle. So I'm just going to say OSS. That's it. I'm just going to call it OSS from now on.
That's totally
but yeah,
fair.
I think that you get a lot of benefits from having the community. And like in a way, the community, you can like push bugs out to the community and you can ask the community to fix it, and you can have like an entire like coding guidelines on like how you contribute. And I think that because you, in a way, it's like you're getting them to fix bugs for free, and you're getting them to add features for free. So that in that way, like that is monetization. It's like they're doing work for you in open source, right? So the community itself is the one that's sort of like working and pushing these things through. But I feel like,
by the way, I'm sorry
you want to say something,
ticker.
Right?
I'm sorry to make the joke ticker. Please go on. I'm actually just listening.
Oh, sorry, we just had something. But I think the benefits that you get from it is that like you have people in the community who are fixing these bugs for you, who are doing a lot of this work for free, purely out of passion and out of like they're consumers of the product and they want to use it. And I think that some of the ways that you can pay it forward for them is like maybe like there are different incentives. Like you can incentivize them to like fix bugs in different ways. You can do like bug bounties and things like that. But I don't think that you should be trying to make money off of open source software that you're using inside of your project. Like you're literally getting that software for free.
Yeah.
So for you trying to monetize off of it, it just feels so bad to me. It just feels wrong.
Yeah, and I should be clear. Like, when I'm talking about like, hey, making money off open source, I think where I was starting was really thinking off of being an open source contributor, right? Because we have actually been through this other thing which you're referring to, which is a very real thing. Is that especially we'll probably come back to this in a future episode, especially as SaaS developers. There was this point when some SaaS developers sort of exist, or SaaS teams worked in sort of a weird legal almost loophole where it was like, hey, this software is supposed to be non-commercial, so you couldn't distribute it like on a CD or a downloadable for money, but you could host it on your own system and use it to run your SaaS product for money, right? And make it part of your secret sauce is like why your product was so cool. And this is, I think, for a lot of large corps, they've sort of solved this problem. There definitely is a state where, depending on the license of that open source product, like if you're selling SaaS, a lot of people will tell you, no, you want to get rid of those dependencies. I know of at least 2 large enterprises that were reliant on a ton of open source software that said, yeah, the way that we're doing this is like, maybe obey the spirit of the license, of the letter of the license, but not the spirit. And so, yeah, no, I definitely think that, like, the process of just trying to grab like a bunch of open source libraries and say, hey, now I have proprietary software, like I have something from there, that's going to be a tough road, right? Because you're going to beg the question when you come to ask for help from the community, like, hey, why don't you pay for this, right? If you're making money off of our stuff, like why aren't you paying for this? And I think that sort of was the Log4j situation. It's like you literally have people who are getting paid millions of dollars a year as CTOs, like messaging someone who gets paid nothing off of this project, be like, hey, I rely on Log4j or this, this Java system, and I'm offering you nothing often. Like very often the system to create bug bounties and stuff is very slow, so people aren't able to just say like, hey, I want to offer you this immediately. And I think fundamentally too, another thing that you mentioned is the issue of, are you engaging with this project at all? So this is pretty common, is like, hey, we can't fix these bugs ourselves because we don't know how this library works or anything. It's like, well, how many people at your company rely on this library? 200, 300. It's like, well, okay, now that's starting to get messed up, right? Like that's starting to be like, hey, maybe you should be fixing some bugs and closing some issues. And in fact, there are a lot of screenshots floating around of like, hey, when are you going to fix this? When are you going to get on this? Like from Oracle Corp or something. It's like, hey, maybe you should get on this. Like, yeah, I think. Sorry, go ahead.
I think it's tricky for someone that wants to be an open source developer full time. So maybe we can talk about that and what that would entail, right? So if I want to dedicate all of my time to contributing to open source projects and I want to try to, make that like a lucrative business for myself, then that means that the company needs to do something to incentivize me to want to continue to contribute to that project.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, please.
And I think that there are ways that they can do that. But I think that a lot of open source projects sort of start as like this is something that I need for one of my, like, maybe it's like a passion project or something like that. So like, you know what, let me just develop this like library or this module, push it out to the community, and then I'll maintain it. And then it gets to the point where like now you have hundreds and thousands of people starring and forking your repository or downloading it. And now it's like there's a bunch of bugs or something, and now they expect you to fix that. Where it's like, if you just have good, like, you don't have to feel like you have to fix all of those bugs. If you have good guidelines on how you can contribute back to the code, then you can say, you know what, yep, that's a bug. You acknowledge it. You let someone else go fix it. That's going to consume it. It doesn't have to consume all of your time, right? You can rely on the community. And I think that, that's where I would start.
Yeah, and I think, GitHub sponsorships and that kind of stuff have really helped people maybe at least give an indicator that they care about that community. And I would like to see a little more of that. One of the things that I if this is totally a feature in GitHub sponsorships and I don't know about it, I apologize in advance to the GitHub team. You people are amazing. But I think something that would be kind of neat to me is a little bit of this Twitch thinking where, being a bigger subscriber gives you more and more sort of status. And it's not like real status, right? You can't decide what happens on the stream or control unless they have set up their subscriptions that way, right? It's not like, you really have real authority, but at least people can see like, oh, this person contributes a lot to the stream or a lot to multiple streams and that kind of stuff. And so something that would kind of be interesting to me to see that evolve into is have that GitHub sponsorship thing show a little bit more like, hey, this is somebody who's asking for help, and they contribute and support a ton of other repositories on here. I am a huge supporter of that sponsorship model. I have seen GitHub or I've seen large orgs struggle with it significantly. So at least twice I've seen people get really excited about sponsorships, create a bunch of sponsorships, and then it just kind of languishes at the team. And I get it that there's somebody in finance who's like, wait, what are we buying here? Right. And it's like, well, goodwill. We're buying goodwill. You know, like we're supporting the stuff that we want. Well, cool. You're supporting the software that we like. So what's the SLA that we got for this money? None, right? And I mean, sure, you can say, hey, it's 2% of what we're paying when we get an SLA, but I've seen that kind of hit corporate culture pretty hard. It's like they don't know quite how to deal with it. I'll look at a couple of the comments on here that do stand out. One is, asking this question of like, how much of your revenue should you be spending on open source software? And then this person says, well, doesn't that vary a lot by the size of your org? And I think the second thing would be like, it varies a lot by how much software is really part of your deal, right? If you're using an open source tool to make a storefront for your pizza shop, you would still kind of say, hey, the competitive thing about my pizza shop is the pizza, right? Whereas like, hey, if you're running a SaaS company, right? You really should. I mean, I hope you're pretty appreciative of the open source stuff that you use, right? And you're giving back pretty extensively because your software is kind of it, right? Here, it's like, hey, if you want to do this, make it closed source and sell it. I think this is probably an attitude. I'm not trying to drag you, Mike 85. You seem, I don't know anything about you, but when we talk about paying for open source, I'm not really sitting here saying, oh, there's some moral responsibility to pay for it. There's lots of amazing jobs that happen by volunteer work, by people who want cloud in the community, and that's all they want. Like tons and tons of them. But I think, when you talk about like the Log4j situation, or there's 100 others in the last year, a lot of this is, corps want to pay for this stuff, right? They want to be able to contribute because they need help, right? They need help with this code. They want support. They want this work to keep happening. They do not want to be in the position of adopting something open source and having the project die and no longer be maintained, right? So both people are getting something, right? This is not something where it's like, oh, I gave this away and I'm being so generous and I'm like mad I'm not getting my own, right? Like it's much more about mutual benefit, right? Creating a relationship between these people.
I agree with that. It's one thing that this reminds me of, Nico? This reminds me of people who like to play games but won't spend $1 on a game.
Yeah.
That we don't have to like get sidetracked on that, but I think that if you want, like, the quickest way to show support for something is to, put your money where your mouth is. If you really enjoy playing that game, then like maybe spend $1 on that game or something like that. But like that's just sort of how I think about it. When you think about all of the work that goes into developing games, is a lot, right? So like for people to like be like, well, I'm not gonna play the game because it costs $1 or whatever the case is. It's just like you don't acknowledge how much effort went into it, and you don't want to dismiss someone's hard work.
Yeah, and I definitely think that like sense of entitlement to content is like an absolute thing. And I think that one of the reasons that I know that we're still going to be thinking about this open source stuff for a while is that even paying for content is still this like unresolved issue to a lot of us. Personally, like I spend a lot of money on like subscriptions and content backing and stuff. I hardly notice it, and all the time I benefit from other stuff that I'm like, yeah, I don't pay anything for this, and I'll be interested to see if like GitHub sees maybe some of these new content models, which are less a direct subscription and more of this thing as like a creator fund, where it's like, hey, just people are spending this much time on the site, so you're due this much money, right? Which is probably a tiny amount of money, but it's like, hey, people are coming over every day to like look at your docs, look at your site. That's time on GitHub, right? Time on GitHub for us is valuable. So here's your cut of that, right? Here's your 1% of what that's actually worth to us.
Well, that'd be interesting. Even if they like did something where it was like, maybe GitHub does this already, but like a project Kickstarter or something where they integrate and was like, so many people have like forked or cloned your repository. Maybe set up like a Kickstarter to like fund the development of your project and make it just seamless for you to like, have access to the funds that you need or whatever you may need, or like something like that. Would be super interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one, Shreya, because Shreya asks, how do you convince someone who's hesitant to spend money going down the buy path to do it? I think, for content and other individual stuff that is consumed individually, I think that a lot of successful creators really don't struggle that hard to get a significant number of people to be engaged with it. Now, I understand artists do not have it good, right? Please don't get me wrong there. But it is really tough with open source software because I may love a piece of software that I see at work and it may make my life easier, but most of the benefit is this whole organization's benefit, right? So my level of passion for like getting this thing funded is always going to be somewhere in the middle, right? Where and I saw that with corporations trying to do GitHub sponsorships, is that these developers, this toolkit or library often had champions in the organization, but they weren't as passionate about it as they were about their favorite podcast or their favorite Twitch streamer or something, right? They were just like, yeah, we should back this. And when it came around to like next year, hey, let's renew all our memberships, that person left. We were still relying on the code, right? But the champion is not super passionate because it's the org that's really benefiting, and it's not that individual person. But yeah, I'm sorry. Did you have more to say about that? I think that's a really good point about the comparison between that and content.
No. I think I would just agree with everything that you said. Echo those same sentiments.
So speaking of money, we got to this other story this week. We had the Puppet publishing the DevOps Salaries report. And I showed this to somebody, and they said they really tried to be polite as they responded to it, where they said, there's one of the notes in here is about women reaching pay equity in DevOps. And again, he was trying to be nice, but he did say, I've met trans women in DevOps. I have met no cis women in DevOps. And that's, I'm not saying that there are no women in DevOps. I think that it did point out something it kind of noted to me is like saying that you have pay equity when you don't have equal representation is like, come on now, right? Put it another way. What percentage of your money do you pay to women versus men, right? I bet that the answer is in the single digits for what percentage of pay goes to women. So, that's real. But V, you actually worked at a DevOps company. So I'd love to hear kind of your take on this.
Yeah, I have a lot of feelings about this one actually. So for context, I used to work at LaunchDarkly, which is a developer tool, feature flag management, and I think that being in the DevOps space, I often feel like it's not something that like the average engineer wants to do every single day.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like that because it's not something that's particularly easy, right? But oftentimes I feel like DevOps engineers, maybe now their salaries are like more comparable to software engineers, but I feel like historically they weren't always paid as much.
Yeah.
Or even same thing for like site reliability engineers, SREs.
Yeah.
And I just think that I don't have any like safe words to say, so I just think that it sucks.
Yeah,
they weren't paid as much.
I'll say his name. It was Mike, right? Like, sorry for too deep in TikTok audios there. I apologize, but I think the reality is, I remember when most SREs were hired out of tech support, people who had Linux knowledge, and paid half of what the engineering team was paid. Right, despite the fact that they needed really extreme levels of knowledge to do their job and needed a really specific set of skills to get it done. I would say, by the way, the person I was talking to really had met very few women in DevOps. I have met tons. I have met tons of women in DevOps. I've met tons of women in SRE. I, in fact, know like the SREs that I know well are all women. So that's my experience. It's definitely not that it's all one type of person. But yeah, I think one thing I talk about there is the idea that like the sense of like, hey, this is work I don't want to do. And sometimes there can be this act of almost like psychological safety where it's like, I don't want to do this work, so it must be like not worth my time, right? Like you see this with
Let's talk about that. Let's unpack that, because when it's work that you don't want to do, there could be many reasons why you don't want to do that work, and it really depends on the person. But it doesn't mean that work is easier or like or that your work is more important than that work.
Yeah, I've never had the self-importance to try and say that I was too smart to do front end. Right, I've always had the like self-awareness to be like, yeah, I tried to fix font sizes for a few hours, and I don't want to again.
Yeah.
not a few hours,
Oftentimes,
hundreds of hours. Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, I think oftentimes the work that people don't want to do, and maybe this is just like my own opinion, or this is just how I view it, is work that they're not maybe particularly comfortable doing or good at.
Yeah,
Maybe at least that's how I feel. Like when I say when there are certain things that I shy away from, it's probably because I just haven't learned it well enough, or I don't feel as confident in making those changes, right? Like I gravitate towards the back end all the time. I will make front end changes if I have to, but you know, it's not my jam in the same way that the back end is, right? And it's just like I haven't spent enough time, fully learning front end as intimately as I would like.
yeah. And I think that's the thing is that um, SRE and specifically DevOps in general have grown up into an entire profession on their own. Where I think that for me, it's very easy for me to say, "Hey, I'm not a Linux nerd." Right? Like I'm just not, and I'm not going to claim that that's easier than like it would be very strange to be like, oh, I'm too smart to learn a whole lot of stuff about Linux. I just haven't. So not that I can't, run a few console commands and run top and like kill a process, right? But I'm not any kind of hardcore Linux nerd. I can barely run file permissions easily, right? So yeah, so I think that it should be pretty easy to see, like, yeah, this is a very special set of skills. And I think in the SRE space, another thing is like saying, hey, something broke. We all talked about what was wrong and then we fixed it, but fixing it didn't follow the run book. So let's either update our practice or update the run book. That's a personality very different from a developer personality, right?
Yes, yes, and I think it's my own opinion. It's my own personal opinion that like in order for you to be like a well-rounded engineer, you need to think about what happens after you merge your code into main. Like, how do you
Mm-hmm.
deploy it? How do you observe it? How do you scale it? Like, you can't just be like, well, one and done. It's merged into main, and now I'm going to hand it off to somebody else to go test it, and then somebody else to go make sure that it's properly deployed and make sure that like my Lambda can scale or whatever else the case is, right? Like, I feel like in a way, like the best engineers that I know have some DevOps background and like a
Yeah.
little bit of SRE, and they embody some of those principles.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's, this is something we talked about before the show is that part of the takeaway is, hey, as DevOps engineers get more expensive, one of the ways to inoculate yourself to that as an org is to spend some more time saying like, hey, let's talk about how this is really running in production. Like, it's great that you can write code. It's great that maybe using containerization, you're sort of more accurately simulating the container that your code is going to run inside. But there's other stuff about it running in production, and yeah, you're gonna learn something about that. You're not just gonna hand it off and be like, oh, I don't know, I guess it uses caching or whatever. Like must be the database team's problem or something. Like you gotta get a little deeper than that these days.
Exactly.
But yeah, so the other part of this, right? The promise of DevOps, right, is supposed to be this like merging of these knowledge bases. I think it's maybe true to acknowledge that they're different personas involved, right? Like doing QA or doing SRE or doing DevOps. These might be kind of different, persona. But I also think that you absolutely can say, hey, we expect to have a little bit of this knowledge trickle back. And talking again about psychological safety, one of the reasons that I have seen developers support DevOps people or SREs or QA making less is that it lets them say, I don't have to do that work. Right? If you're in an org where someone else is making half of what you do, and there's a question of who should do it, you or them, right? You should really be the person. It's like, well, clearly your time is too valuable to do it, right? And so, yeah, that just seems like it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's not a good policy to have, right? But yeah.
I agree with that, and like I feel very strongly about this. If someone puts up a PR and it's not tested, I will immediately request changes. I do not believe in this concept of having a dedicated, maybe this is a hot take, but like I think that having a dedicated QA team is very old school, very old fashioned. Engineers that write the code should test their own code.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Period. Like
Yeah.
it just, yeah.
Yeah, and while I definitely think it's worth talking about what special skills like a dedicated QA person brings in, that I think the idea of saying, "Oh yeah, don't worry, we have a QA person, so there's no way to figure out if your code works or not," right? You can just hand it off. It's like, what? Wait. We have all kinds of automated testing tools now. We should be able to figure this out.
Exactly. But the same thing can't like the same way that I think that all engineers should be writing their test. I could easily say I don't think that all engineers should be provisioning the infrastructure. Because not everyone has like intimate knowledge on like how that's going to scale, where it's like if you're writing the code, then you know all of those edge cases, and you
Mm-hmm.
should in theory, be writing your tests first before you even
Yes.
talk about you do the implementation,
Yes.
right? So I feel like it's well within their wheelhouse to go ahead and write the test. But like, am I going to trust the average developer to go ahead and like provision an entire like cluster for me with maybe, or spin up a new VPC and have VPC pairing and all of that? Like, will the average developer know how to do that? And like, I feel like there's a different set of skills that comes with having a DevOps engineer, which
Yes.
I don't want to like undermine what they do, because I don't think it's just like any engineer can do it. It's a
Yeah.
whole separate set of skills.
But the idea that you're like getting some dev knowledge and getting access to the repo or whatever in DevOps, and that therefore you're going to like fix the bugs when the developer like writes something that does not run right or needs to be tested extensively. It's like, well, the developer is the one. This isn't just like, hey, everybody should be responsible for cleaning up after themselves. The developer's the one who wrote this code and works on it, right? So they're going to be the best person to write your unit tests, right? They're going to be the best person to write bug fixes and do these things. So that's why we want to push some of that back and say, hey, you should be doing testing and sort of knowing how this is really going to run in production, because it is a lot more efficient for that person to be making code changes than someone else in the org, like sort of poking at the code in a desultory way at 3 a.m. Right? It's a lot better if that person is there to make those edits.
And I just want to be super clear that that doesn't mean that it eliminates the need for you to have like penetration testers and things like that. That's a whole different set of testing. That's
Yeah.
totally different. That
Yeah.
not like an average QA person is going to be like doing pen tests all the time. Like, it just depends, right? So there's a variety of tests that you need to write. There's like there's functional tests. There's going to be like integration tests. There's going to be like unit tests. Some people think a unit test is different from a functional test. Like, there's a whole bunch of different kinds of tests that you can write, and different skill sets come with, like, you need different skill sets to write those kinds of tests. Same thing for like penetration testing.
I think that's like, yes, we want like some testing knowledge to come back, and security is a great example. We want some security knowledge to filter back to the whole team, right? And it's a little more like, a lot of this stuff is frankly talking about stuff that startups really should get for free, right? Is it like usually the startup, nobody's going to be like, well, that's not really my problem, I'll just like toss it over the fence, as they say, right? Where I've been reading, because I'm a manager now and I have to do stuff like this. Pray for me. I've been reading like management books and stuff, and read Hastings' book and stuff from Netflix. And a lot of it is really, I realize, like, doesn't apply to the kind of work that I do, because I already work at a startup. So maintaining the sense of, hey, everybody just try to keep, the best interest of the company in mind, and everybody should take responsibility for handling expenses and this stuff. I'm like, yeah, that's how startups operate. Like, that's, like when you're 12 people, it's not hard to guarantee that you're going to do that, right? It is just more as you push into this, obviously once you have hundreds of people, you're going to need people who specialize in these things. And things like, there's things that QA understands, like kind of modeling likely user behavior and knowing like common user failure states and stuff, where it's like, we want the developers to have some knowledge of what do people do with this tool, but that's just never going to be something that every single developer is going to be great at.
Agreed.
So the last thing I want to talk about, and this is just kind of glancing at this and chatting about it just a bit, is this project Coolify that was launched on Hacker News a few days ago. And I thought was kind of interesting. It put me a little bit. I was thinking, we talk about making money with open source and having an open source career. This is a single person project. Talking about, no, thank you. I don't want update. Okay. See, I like doing these screen shares, folks, and showing like, here's this thing, but having to show you the state of like, funnel optimization on every page, so that's a little tough. I go to open some story. It's like, sign up for our newsletter. Like, hey, you're on TV right now. Stop doing this. It's annoying. But this is Andras Basai is my understanding of the right way to pronounce that, who, quit his full-time job, like at a FANG company, to say, hey, I want to work on something that I think people will find interesting and useful. And so this is Coolify. V, can you give me like the summary of like what Coolify is like trying to do?
Yeah, basically it's like an open source, like what it says right there, open source and self-hostable Heroku and Netflix, Nexify. And I think what it's trying to do really is it's trying to make sure that developers aren't dependent on these big corporations to deploy and to manage the software.
Mm-hmm.
So moving away from like AWS and things like that, or moving away from GCP, moving away from Azure.
Yeah.
I think that's like the aim of the game with this, and it's trying to like support a bunch of different like different programming languages and databases and things like that. But like some of the things that it supports is not going to be. I think it's off to a good start. Like it just came out, but
Yeah.
it's not going to be like fully extensive, like the same kind of support that like these bigger companies would have.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Right? Because, like there's obviously like, hey, just go host your service on bare metal, or stand up a virtual machine yourself, install all of the libraries, install all the components, and get it configured and run, right? Where, then there's, sort of on the extreme other end is, hey, just press a few buttons and you have like a WordPress service stood up, right? Where I think, oh, this is a good comment, Trey. I'm sorry I missed it. By the way, Trey has this really good comment about whether companies should encourage people to work on open source projects. We'll talk about that in a minute. That's a good question. It's just time lag. I missed it. Sorry about that. But so coming back to Coolify, I think very often when you share something like this, someone's like, well, why wouldn't I just do bare metal? If I'm going a little more self-hosted than Heroku, why wouldn't I just do like a bare metal service or a virtual machine? And I think that's an interesting one, because I think we can actually admit that there are many points along that gradation, right? You could use Wix to like create your own site with a drag and drop, right? And just say, hey, you handle everything. You handle DNS, you handle, SSL certificates, you handle everything. We can also like, start ordering RAM off of AliExpress and like, hooking up our own rack and calling the phone company to try to get a T3 line or what, whatever piece of internet backbone. So there's always going to be gradations along that path. And so this is like, okay, let's get a little more independent and self-hosted than, just running something on Lightsail or running something on Heroku, but let's be a little more optimized than just, hey, you have to sit here and configure every piece of this Linux server yourself, right? So there's clearly a nice amount of modularity. I'm just gonna like, okay, not all of these are click through. Let's see. Let's just click through to WordPress. So I guess let's take a look at some docs here. So we can move multiple Git sources. So I apologize. I did not get a chance to like install and go really deep on this before the show. I think one of the questions I had is that, we sort of mentioned these components, and I'm curious, like, is there like a library of examples that shows like how to do, like, okay, I want to run a ghost service here, like quite what is the implementation path to get there, right? We can work with multiple Git sources. I get that. But yeah, like
go to applications and it'll show you. So if you want to go ahead and like spin up like a Go application or a Node application or anything like that, it's going to point you to Docker Hub, I think. And that's the Docker
okay.
image that you would use. So I think that's like the standard that they're pushing. Same thing. Like if you look at like it's looking at like different Docker images. So if you wanted to go ahead and build like a Rust application, you would just point to you would go to Docker Hub, you would get the latest image, and you'd pull it down that way.
Got it. Got it. Okay. And there's just kind of like a little bit about secrets. It's not obviously this is not like, hey, here's how to do everything start to finish, but obviously you could use it for if you can run a Go Docker image, you can build a lot. Obviously, if you can run a Rust Docker image, you can't run anything. But that don't mention that to Rust developers; it'll upset them. But yeah, so I do get the concept. I also think like speaking about monetization and contributing to open source, I think that this is a really good example where trying to like get people to deploy in a different way and build in a different way is interesting and often is going to make sense as like a relatively small project to just see like, hey, is this something that like engages people? It may not make as much sense as like, hey, I went and raised a Series A and I've got like 100 people working on this and it's like this major thing, right? You kind of want to see like, is there interest in this and like building and deploying this way?
Yeah, I would agree. I think that some of the things that you have to think about is how reliable is it going to be? Like when AWS has an outage, like the
Mhm.
internet is like like the internet just kind of crumbles sometimes, right? If some depending on what service goes out in AWS. So I think that if you're going to take a gamble on something new, then like you really want to ensure that it's like reliable.
Yeah, so this is an interesting one because definitely your primary motivation here is you want for whatever reason to be independent of these large cloud providers, right? Um, and I think that independence is probably going to be something different. It's not you're not probably saying, hey, I'm going to be more reliable than than even like the most unreliable cloud service, right? Um, you're not probably claiming that it's going to be like cheaper, right? So you're going to have motivations that are complex there, right? Maybe you're dealing with data sovereignty issues. Maybe I think one reason that I've seen like some stuff around like self-hosted serverless and stuff, which feels almost oxymoronic when you go to just find it the first time. But frankly, what is like a self-hosted Docker cluster, right? Like, like what is that? But hey, we want to set the stuff up ourselves, and the purpose of it is to make development faster within our team, but we still want to maintain control of it, right?
Yep.
Where a very curious situation that came up quite a bit, especially as Docker started to become very common, is that you ended up having like a few like Docker experts. This is like people who would be DevOps engineers a few years later, right? And you can still say, hey, that accelerated the whole team because we only needed a few people on the team who were like experts in this thing. And yeah, I mean, I don't think Unjust is not claiming like, hey, this is for everybody. This is something that everybody needs to do because for sure, right? Like, having your entire infrastructure of a large company rely on someone's passion project or I thought this would be interesting is probably not great, right? You probably want to have like an SLA with those people if you're gonna dive really deep. Sorry, I keep saying SLA as if everybody knows like what that means. That's a service level agreement. It means that there's an understanding of how quickly problems are going to get fixed and how quickly questions are going to get answered. So this means that when you spend millions and millions of dollars on hosting from any kind of large provider, you have both like, hey, I can for sure always call someone and get help, but also like if the system is down for a certain amount of time, you can get your money back. Right. And one of the things SREs do is they track like, hey, we've been down this much this quarter. So we can afford to be down this much more before there is a legal case to say, hey, we owe people like refunds now for the service that they paid for. So that's SLAs. And in fact, SREs define these like points that are like, obviously they don't want to just come in and say, hey, we just broke SLA. They like have all these prior points where they warn about this. And I'll link in the show notes to Diamond, who is an SRE professional who like explained all of this stuff to me and was actually like a fascinating writer and talker, speaker about SRE stuff. But yeah, I think this is an interesting project. I might try to get it installed on a future stream just to kind of see how it works and tool around with it a little bit. But yeah, it seems neat. I'll put a link in the show notes. Do you have other thoughts about it? I've been talking a lot. You know what it is, folks? I had 2 of these Frappuccino things, these little bottles. I'm too hyper today.
They're good. They're really good. No,
Guilty.
I think I'm gonna try and play with it a little bit. I haven't had the chance to play with it enough. So I'm interested to see how it works. Like I have experience with Heroku in the past. So I just want to see how it compares. And I think that one cool thing about this is that like it may allow you to just move more quickly. Like if you have experience like setting up a new EC2 instance in like AWS, or like working with security groups, and like I am in general with AWS, like it's a steep learning curve. Like I've
Mm-hmm.
always found like every issue that I've had with, I haven't punched a proper hole. Like I don't have like, it's always like a security group issue. Like for me
Yeah.
personally, for
Yeah.
like any application
Oh,
that I'm developing.
absolutely. And in fact, like when
So
someone says, "Oh, don't worry, we give everyone an AWS account, we give them all access," it's like, "Oh yeah, then you effed up IAM permissions for the millionth time, and it doesn't work." And it's like,
exactly.
and it just, I feel like a lot of developers out there have gotten the implicit message of like, "Yeah, everybody has access, and you're free to do it, but don't." Right.
Yeah.
So this can make that a little simpler. It's totally worth exploring.
Yeah. Agreed. Agreed. And I want to make sure that we get to Shreya's question.
Oh yeah. So here's the weirdest thing. I don't know if it's some kind of weird little hole in the StreamYard thing. It's like that comment is not showing up in the StreamYard feed, so I can't put it on the screen. But I will read it out.
Oh
Which is
yeah, showing up for me.
thoughts on whether companies should encourage their engineers to work on open source projects on the side and how they should go about it. And I've been talking first all afternoon, so I apologize for that. But I will say there was a pretty good. There was actually like a webcomic forum that talked about how one of the things that happened at Facebook quite a bit is they would hire people who were the creators or the maintainers of open source projects. And that was like, it was one of the ways that open source developers got paid, essentially, was they was like, hey, you got this great, cushy job. But when that person often was still working on it as a like passion project. So when they left, their replacement would come in and say, oh, yeah, I'm happy to keep maintaining this thing. Obviously, you replace me. This is my specialty. During working hours, right? This is my job, right? You want me to maintain this thing, answer these issues, solve these problems for other people. That's going to be, you're going to pay me for that, right? I don't have time to do anything else for you because I'm going to maintain this thing full time or half time or whatever. And so that then like Facebook would come back. Well, I don't know this happened in specific cases with Facebook. They're saying as an example, this might be a problem, which is that person would get like poor performance reviews. The other guy was able to pump out a bunch of features because they were working on this open source thing at night. So yeah, Shrey, it's a great question. It's a real balance of saying how much time do you spend? You say you want people to work on passion projects or something, or to work on these open source projects, but how do you make that division?
Yeah, I think like in my experience at every company I've been at, we've had like an open source strategy. Like what was our
Mm-hmm.
commitment to the community? What was the strategy like? And how do we want to be involved in the open source community in general? Right. So I think that companies to ask themselves those pointed questions, and then figure out like what kind of involvement and engagement you have, and like see you're using something that is like a critical part of your entire application, and it's an open source project, and like I feel like the company at the very least should be contributing to that. That's just like my own opinion. Like
Yeah,
rather than like getting all the benefits from just like consuming it, like trying to contribute back to it would be like, you know, a good thing to do.
yeah. I think one of the fundamental breaks there is often like pumping out features is very often the only thing that engineering teams have an easy time like explaining that that's what they do. So when it comes time to say, hey, I we need to have an open source strategy and we need to make some commits to this, it's like, well, okay, well, that's like we're losing that time. We might as well be paying that person to play golf or do a team meeting or like anything else. It's like, no. Like, let's explain how increasing the confidence of your team is important, because the thing with having someone spend 5% of their time closing a few issues on an open source project is that then when you have a critical need with that project, then that person knows how to get through this repository and what the heck is going on inside of it. Because I mean, at least in my experience, when I try to contribute to open source, if I just want to dive in and try to fix some bug, the very first thing is I spend hours sometimes being like, okay, how does this thing even work, right? Like, where are the pieces? Where's the important code? Where should I be looking? And so, yeah, it's major if you spend that time. That when the clutch happens, then you're ready to be able to do what you need to.
Exactly.
This was so nice. Let's not invite Treya back. This was fun. I mean, Shreya, I'm sorry, but it's just not working out. No, that's not true. This wasn't a spell without Shreya.
We miss Shreya.
We miss Shreya. Shreya, please drink. Now here's what I recommend. I say some kind of tea, like an English breakfast tea, a couple slices of ginger, a couple slices of lemon, little lemon juice, and some honey, and you get that nice and hot. Now we really got something for the throat and the whole system. The whole system is improved by that. I think you can add if you're okay with drinking, you say like a tablespoon of whiskey, not too much. I recommend a Japanese whiskey. There's like the Suntory Toki, it's very light, very very playful, right? A very very nice cure for the old throat. On that note, I'll ask V, where do you want to be found?
Find me on Twitter at VBot2. Somebody stole VBot1 or something, so I'm 2. But find me on Twitter there, or you can find me on LinkedIn, and my DMs are open.
This is the same way I became serverless_mom was serverless mom got lost. It's one of those things.
Yeah, it's hard.
And for me, you can find me at serverless_mom. You can find Shreya at Shrey the Cray. That's SHREYTHECREY. Shreya, I remembered how your Twitter name is spelled, so I think we know where my heart is. Folks, we will be back next week to talk about SaaS development and SaaS development questions. I'm going to try to bring on some SaaS developers. I think I'm going to bug Andras to come on and have him watch us try to install this thing. So
that'd be great.
Yeah, that'd be fun. Okay, thank you, everybody. I am going to hit the end broadcast button because I do not have an outro video yet. So anyway, thanks for joining. Bye.